I remember the taste of wine turning to ash in my mouth when the black sky first tore open above the forum. My name is Marcus Aurelius Corvus, Tribune of the 14th Legion, and I watched the impossible happen. Rome, eternal Rome, ripped from the 3rd century Anno Domini, and cast into a nightmare that had no name in any language we knew. The stars were wrong, the gods were silent, and the things that came screaming through the darkness wore the faces of demons our ancestors had only whispered about in the darkest hours. You think Rome conquered the known world through discipline and steel alone, but you don't know what we found when we were thrown 40,000 years into a future where humanity had forgotten what mercy meant. This is the testimony of how the greatest empire in human history faced the cruelest galaxy imaginable. This is the story of whether Roman virtue could survive when the universe itself had gone mad. This is what happened when the eagle met the aquila. Chapter 1. The day the sky broke. The Ides of March meant something different in my timeline. It was the year 235 Anno Domini, by the reckoning of our calendar. Emperor Alexander Severus had been dead mere months, murdered by his own troops in Germania, and the empire teetered on the edge of chaos. I was stationed in Pannonia with Legio 14th Gemina, maintaining order on the Danube frontier, while ambitious generals across the empire sharpened their swords and counted their loyal legions. We'd just finished morning drills when the sky split apart. I'd seen storms before. I'd witnessed lightning that seemed to walk across the earth. I'd campaigned in lands where the weather itself felt hostile. But this was something beyond nature, beyond the gods, beyond anything in human experience. The blue vault of heaven simply cracked, like pottery struck by a hammer. Through the fissures came light that hurt to see, colours that had no names in Latin or Greek, shades that made men's eyes water and their minds recoil. The crack spread across the entire visible sky, and through it I glimpsed something vast and terrible. Geometries that shouldn't exist, spaces that folded in on themselves, darkness alive with malevolent intelligence. "Mars, protect us," whispered Centurion Valerius beside me. His hand went instinctively to the amulet he wore, a small figure of the war god that he'd carried through 20 years of campaigns. The ground began to shake. Not the tremors of earthquake, I'd felt those in Judea, but something rhythmic, purposeful, as if the earth itself was being lifted and moved. Around us, the fortress camp of Carnuntum began to distort. Buildings remained solid, but the spaces between them warped, stretching like oil on water. My men were veterans. They'd faced Germanic barbarians, Sarmatian cavalry, bandit hordes, and each other in the brutal hierarchy of legion life. But now they stood frozen, watching the impossible happen, their training failing them in the face of something no Roman had ever prepared for. "Form testudo," I shouted, falling back on the only thing I knew: discipline. Whatever is happening, we face it as Romans. We face it as soldiers. The veterans responded automatically, shields locked, formation tightened. Even in the face of cosmic impossibility, Roman discipline held. We stood in our protective shell of overlapping shields while reality came apart around us. The transition lasted hours or seconds. Time itself became uncertain. I felt movement without motion, saw distance without travel. It was as if the entire region, perhaps the entire empire, was being lifted by invisible hands and carried across an incomprehensible gulf. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The sky was wrong. Where before we'd seen the familiar blue of a spring afternoon, now there was darkness. Not night. I'd seen night 1,000 times on campaign. This was the void of space itself, dotted with stars that burned in unfamiliar configurations. And moving among those stars were things that made my blood freeze. Massive structures of metal and stone, larger than any city, suspended in the darkness like siege engines built by gods gone mad. But we weren't in space. We stood on solid ground. The fortress was intact. The Danube still flowed. I could hear it. Yet above us was the naked void. "Tribune," Valerius said, his voice tight with suppressed terror. The stars, they're not. The constellations are all wrong. He was right. I'd learned to navigate by the stars during campaigns in Africa. I knew Polaris, the Great Bear, Orion's Belt, but the stars above us now formed patterns I'd never seen, arranged in ways that seemed almost purposeful, almost watchful. Movement on the horizon caught my eye. I raised my hand for silence, and 500 men became as still as statues. There, in the distance, something was approaching. At first, I thought it was a building moving across the landscape. Impossible, but everything was impossible now. As it drew closer, I realized it was a vehicle of some kind, massive, armored, moving without horses or oxen or slaves to pull it. The ground shook with each movement, and from its surface protruded weapons that I recognized instinctively despite never having seen their like. Engines of war, designed to kill on a scale that made Roman artillery look like children's toys. It stopped perhaps 500 paces from our position. A portion of its armored hull opened, and figures emerged. They were men. Or they had been men once. Each stood perhaps 8 feet tall, encased in armor that seemed to be part of their very bodies. The armor was colored a deep crimson and bronze, decorated with eagles and lightning bolts, and symbols that looked disturbingly familiar. They moved with mechanical precision, carrying weapons that hummed with barely contained violence. The leader stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice emerged from a speaker grill in his helmet, amplified and distorted, but speaking Latin. Classical Latin, the tongue of Cicero and Caesar, not the vulgar camp Latin of my soldiers. I am Sergeant Titus Sulla of the Ultramarines chapter, Adeptus Astartes, servants of the God Emperor of mankind. Identify yourselves. God Emperor. The title made something cold settle in my stomach. Rome had fought the cult of the Eastern god kings for centuries. We'd executed their messiah in Judea. We'd persecuted their followers when they threatened the social order. The idea of a god emperor was everything Rome stood against. But we were clearly not in Rome anymore. I stepped forward, letting my shield drop slightly so they could see my face. Marcus Aurelius Corvus, Tribune of the 14th Legion Gemina, in service to the Senate and people of Rome. By what authority do you speak of emperors? And by what sorcery have we been brought to this place? The Space Marine, the term appeared in my mind though I didn't know why, tilted his head slightly. Through his helmet's eye lenses, I saw a faint glow that might have been his actual eyes. You claim to serve Rome? The ancient Rome? Impossible. Rome fell 10,000 years before the Emperor unified Terra. 10,000 years. The number was so vast it lost meaning. Rome had existed for less than 1,000 years. The idea that it had fallen, that millennia had passed, that we had somehow been thrown into a future beyond imagining, it was too much to process. I serve Rome, I repeated, because it was the only truth I knew with certainty. And I demand to know what has happened to my legion, my empire, and my world. The Space Marine gestured, and more armored figures emerged from the vehicle. These were smaller, more human-sized, though they wore armor that still put my Lorica segmentata to shame. They carried weapons that I recognized as weapons despite their alien design. You've been caught in a warp storm, the Space Marine said. A tear in the fabric of reality itself. Such storms can transport ships, even entire planets, across space and time. If you truly are from ancient Terra, from Rome before the fall, then you have traveled not just across space, but across 40,000 years of human history. 40,000 years. Around me, I heard my men murmuring prayers to the gods, Mars, Jupiter, Minerva, the traditional Roman pantheon that had sustained us through countless campaigns. But something in the Space Marine's posture suggested that our gods were no longer relevant in this nightmare future. What happened to Rome? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. It fell, as all empires fall. But from its ashes rose the Imperium of Man, the greatest empire humanity has ever known. 1 million worlds united under the God Emperor's rule. We are his angels of death, created to defend humanity from the horrors that lurk in the darkness between the stars. He gestured to the sky above, to the void and the massive structures moving through it. This is Terra, your homeworld, but it has been transformed beyond anything you would recognize. The entire surface is covered in cities that reach into the upper atmosphere. Billions upon billions of souls live here, all serving the Emperor's will. Terra, Earth, home, but not a home I could ever recognize. And what of us? I asked. What happens to a legion from Rome's past, cast into Rome's future? The Space Marine was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something that might have been pity from a being I wasn't sure could feel pity anymore. That depends on whether you can adapt. The Imperium has no place for weakness, for sentiment, for anything that doesn't serve the Emperor's will. Your technology is primitive. Your understanding of the universe is incomplete. Your gods are dead or never existed. But if you can learn, if you can serve, if you can prove yourselves worthy of survival in the 41st Millennium. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The alternative was clear: adapt or die. I looked back at my men. 500 veterans of the 14th Legion, the best Rome could produce, disciplined, trained, experienced in warfare across 3 continents, but facing a future where our weapons were obsolete, our gods were lies, and our empire was dust. We are Romans, I said, straightening my shoulders. We conquered the known world through discipline, through adaptation, through refusing to surrender. If Rome fell, then we will learn why. If this Imperium claims Rome's legacy, we will see if they earned it. And if the universe has become a nightmare, then Romans will face it as Romans always have, with steel in our hands and the eagle at our backs. The Space Marine nodded slowly. Then follow me, Tribune. I will take you to those who can explain what you face. But know this: the galaxy of the 41st Millennium is a dark and terrible place. Humanity is besieged on all sides by xenos, by demons, by traitors, and heretics. War is eternal. Mercy is weakness. Faith in the Emperor is the only truth that matters. He turned back toward his vehicle, then paused. One more thing, Tribune. Your legion's number. 4 Sci-Fi. In the Imperium, there were 20 Space Marine legions created by the Emperor himself. Half of them fell to chaos and became traitors. The others remain loyal. You should know that many of us still honor the old ways, the discipline and structure that Rome exemplified. The Ultramarines in particular see ourselves as Rome's true heirs. With that, he strode back to his transport. My men looked to me for orders, for leadership, for some indication of what we should do. I looked at the unfamiliar stars, at the massive city structures hanging in the void above Terra, at the Space Marines who claim to be Rome's inheritors. Form column, I commanded. We march as Romans. Whatever this future holds, we will face it with the same courage that won Rome an empire. We marched into the unknown, following giants in powered armor, leaving behind everything we'd ever known. The 14th Legion had entered the 41st Millennium. Only time would tell if we could survive it. Chapter 2. The Weight of 40 Millennia. They took us to what they called the Administratum Complex, a fortress building so vast that my entire legion could have camped within its grounds, with room for 10 more besides. The Space Marines had transported us in their vehicle. They called it a Land Raider, and experiencing it was like being inside the belly of a mechanical beast. The journey covered hundreds of miles in what felt like minutes, and through viewing ports, I caught glimpses of the new Terra. Nothing remained of the world I knew. The rolling hills and forests of Pannonia had been replaced by endless urban sprawl. Massive towers, they called them hive spires, rose into the darkness above, so tall that clouds formed around their peaks. The air itself tasted of metal and chemicals, nothing like the clean wind I'd known. And everywhere, millions upon millions of people moved like ants, tiny figures dwarfed by architecture built on an inhuman scale. We'd emerged from the warp storm somewhere in what had once been the Pannonian Basin, apparently transported along with a significant chunk of the surrounding territory. The Space Marines had detected us immediately. Their technology could sense disruptions across the entire planet, they claimed, monitoring Terra for threats from within and without. Now we stood in a vast chamber decorated in a style that was almost Roman, but grotesquely exaggerated. Eagles adorned every surface, but these were two-headed monsters, not the simple aquila my legion carried. Columns rose to ceiling heights that hurt the neck to follow, inscribed with what looked like names, millions upon millions of names, perhaps honoring the dead of 40,000 years of warfare. The Imperium of Man spans the galaxy, explained our liaison, a man who introduced himself as Adept Quintus Martellus. He wasn't a space marine, but what they called an administrator. Essentially, a scribe with authority over resources that could feed entire provinces. 1 million inhabited worlds, quadrillions of human souls, all united under the Emperor's rule. He'd summoned maps, not parchment maps, but glowing three-dimensional projections that showed the galaxy itself. I stared at it, trying to comprehend the scale. The known world that Rome had conquered was nothing, not even a grain of sand. Just one tiny planet in an endless sea of stars. Terra is the throne world, Martellus continued. The sacred heart of the Imperium, where the God Emperor himself resides in eternal vigil. You emerged here, on humanity's holiest ground. That alone is unusual. Warp storms rarely deposit their catches on Terra itself. You keep calling him God, I said, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. Romans know the difference between men and gods. What emperor claims divinity? Martellus's expression shifted to something between pity and concern. The emperor is not merely a man who claims godhood, Tribune. He is the master of mankind, the anathema to chaos, the light in the darkness. He unified Terra during the Age of Strife, created the Space Marines from his own genetic template, and has protected humanity for 10,000 years despite being confined to the Golden Throne. Confined? The Emperor is neither living nor dead. He sits upon a life support throne, sustaining humanity's lighthouse through the warp, the Astronomicon, through his psychic might. 10,000 psychers sacrifice themselves daily to fuel his divine will. He is simultaneously dying and eternal, present and distant, human and transcendent. I'd learned enough in the past hours to recognize psychers as what Romans might call augurs or oracles, those touched by powers beyond normal understanding. But 10,000 daily sacrifices. The number was staggering, reminiscent of the blood-soaked altars of Carthage or the endless tribute of the Aztecs in the distant lands across the Western Ocean. This imperium sounds more like a cult than an empire, I observed carefully. Martellus's face hardened. The imperium is all that stands between humanity and extinction. You haven't seen what lurks in the darkness, Tribune. The xenos, races that would exterminate us. The demons of chaos that would corrupt and consume us. The traitors who would undo everything the Emperor built. Faith in the Emperor isn't superstition, it's survival. He activated another projection, and I wish he hadn't. It showed creatures from Nightmare. Green-skinned monsters wielding crude but devastating weapons. Insectoid horrors that moved in endless swarms. Mechanical skeletons that seemed to phase in and out of reality. And worse, things that weren't quite material. Entities of pure malevolence that wore faces stolen from victims' fears. The galaxy is not empty, Martellus said quietly. Humanity shares it with xenos who see us as prey, as rivals, as resources to be exploited. And beyond even them, in the warp itself, the chaos gods wait. They are the embodiment of humanity's worst impulses: violence, scheming, plague, and excess. They corrupt, they twist, they damn, and they are eternal. I thought of Rome's enemies, the Germanic tribes, the Parthian Empire, the scattered kingdoms of the East. They were humans ultimately. We could negotiate, could understand their motives, could defeat them through superior tactics and discipline. But these xenos, these demons, how did you negotiate with something that saw you as food? How did you defeat something that wasn't even fully material? Your Legion, Martellus said, shifting subjects. The 14th. You numbered 500 when the Space Marines found you. Are there more? The Legion's full strength is 5,000, I said, though I had no idea if they'd survived the transition. We were spread across Pannonia, maintaining border security. I commanded a single cohort. We've detected other temporal anomalies, Martellus admitted. It's possible more of your forces survived the warp storm. But Tribune, you must understand, even 5,000 Romans would be a drop in the ocean of the Imperium's military might. We number our armies in the billions, entire regiments that could crush ancient Rome's total military force without noticing. Then why not simply dismiss us? I challenged. If we're so insignificant, why this meeting? Why the explanation? Martellus smiled slightly. Because the Ultramarines requested it. Because Sergeant Sulla recognized something in your discipline, your bearing. The Imperium values efficiency, but some among us still honor history. Rome, ancient Rome, is legendary. The foundation of human civilization, the template for countless successor states. Your survival is interesting. Interesting enough to spare? That depends on you. The Imperium has no place for civilians, for those who cannot contribute. You're soldiers, which helps. But your weapons are antiquated, your tactical doctrine obsolete, your understanding of the enemy non-existent. You would need to be trained, equipped, integrated into the Imperial Guard if you're to be of any use. The Imperial Guard, I'd learned, was the Imperium's primary military force. Billions upon billions of soldiers drawn from across 1 million worlds, equipped with weapons that made Roman artillery look like children's toys. They died in such numbers that individual lives barely registered in the Imperium's calculations. What choice do we have? I asked bluntly. Serve or die, Martellus said simply. Those are always the choices in the Imperium. Serve the Emperor's will, contribute to humanity's survival, or be deemed unworthy of the resources your existence consumes. There is no retirement, no peaceful civilian life for those who can fight. There is only war. Only war. The phrase had appeared multiple times in my brief exposure to this nightmare future. It seemed to be more than doctrine. It was theology, philosophy, and reality all combined. A commotion outside the chamber interrupted us. Raised voices, the sound of armored boots. Then the doors burst open to admit more of my men. Centurion Valerius led them, and his face carried news I both hoped for and dreaded. Tribune, we found more of the Legion. Cohorts 3 through 7 survived the transition, along with elements of the cavalry and auxiliaries. Nearly 3,000 men total, scattered across what these people call subsector Pannonia Tertius. 3,000. Not the full Legion, but more than I dared hope. Enough to maintain unit cohesion, to preserve command structure, to remain recognizably Roman, rather than becoming scattered individuals absorbed into this vast machine of an empire. Where are they? I demanded. Being processed, Martellus said, already working at a terminal that responded to his touch with glowing symbols. My staff is conducting preliminary assessments, checking for chaos taint, cataloging equipment, determining combat readiness by Imperial standards. Chaos taint, his expression darkened. The warp is not empty space, Tribune. It's a dimension of pure psychic energy where demons dwell. Extended exposure can corrupt even the strongest minds. Your journey through the warp storm could have left influences. We must be certain none of your men have been touched by chaos before we allow them to integrate. The implications were chilling. We'd survived being thrown 40,000 years into the future, only to face execution if this chaos had somehow infected us during the journey. And if you find this corruption? I asked carefully. Purging, immediate and total. Better to lose 1,000 men than allow a single chaos-tainted individual to spread corruption. He said it without emotion, as if discussing crop yields rather than mass execution. I met his eyes, letting him see the steel that had gotten me promoted to Tribune, despite my relatively young age. Then you will allow me to observe these tests. If my men are to be judged, a Roman officer will witness it. Martellus considered, then nodded. Acceptable. But understand, Tribune, if we find taint, you cannot stop the purge. Imperial law supersedes any authority you imagine you possess. I understand, I said, though understanding and accepting were different things. When do we begin? Immediately. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica has already deployed psychic assessment teams. We should have results within hours. Hours. Roman discipline had been built over centuries. Now we would be judged in hours by standards we didn't understand, using methods that looked like sorcery, by an empire that valued efficiency over mercy. As we moved toward the assessment chambers, I looked back at the projection of the galaxy, at the million worlds, the endless stars, the vast distances between everything. Rome had conquered the Mediterranean world through discipline, through adaptation, through the willingness to learn from enemies and integrate useful practices. We'd taken the Greek phalanx and improved it. We'd adopted Germanic cavalry tactics. We'd absorbed the engineering knowledge of conquered peoples. Could we do it again? Could ancient Roman discipline adapt to a galaxy of horrors? Could soldiers trained to fight barbarian tribes learn to face xenos monsters and warp demons? I touched the eagle standard my men had carried through the warp storm. It was one of the Legion's secondary standards, not the precious silver aquila kept at the Legion fortress, but it was still Rome's symbol. The eagle endures, I murmured, using the Legion's traditional saying. Somewhere in this nightmare future, Rome's legacy had supposedly continued. The Ultramarines claimed it. This Imperium wore its symbols, but they'd twisted it, changed it, made it into something that would have horrified Cincinnatus or Cato. Perhaps ancient Rome, true Rome, could teach them something they'd forgotten in 40,000 years of endless war. Or perhaps we'd simply be consumed. Another footnote in an empire so vast that our entire civilization was merely ancient history. Time would tell, and Romans had always been patient conquerors. Chapter 3. The Trial of Faith. The psychic assessment chamber looked like a temple designed by a madman. They'd gathered my 3,000 men in a massive hangar space that could have held 20 cohorts with room for maneuvers. At the chamber's center stood a structure that hurt to look at directly. Crystalline spires arranged in geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, all of them humming with energy that made my teeth ache. "That's a psychic resonance array," explained the woman who introduced herself as Interrogator Cassia of the Ordo Hereticus. She wore black robes decorated with skulls and eagles, and her eyes had an intensity that reminded me of the most zealous augurs in Rome's temples. It amplifies psychic emanations, allowing our sanctioned psychers to detect any trace of chaos corruption. Sanctioned psychers stood at each point of the array, men and women whose eyes had been ritually removed, blood weeping from empty sockets, their faces bearing expressions of transcendent agony. They swayed in unison, chanting in a language I didn't recognize, their voices harmonizing in ways that made reality feel thin and uncertain. My men watched this with barely concealed horror. Romans were not superstitious barbarians. We tolerated foreign cults, respected the gods of others, maintained practical relationships with divine forces. But this looked less like religion and more like torture dressed in theological garments. "Your men will pass through the array one at a time," Cassia continued. "The process is uncomfortable, but not harmful unless corruption is detected. If a man is clean, he'll experience brief disorientation and perhaps mild nausea. If he's tainted..." She gestured to a side chamber where I could see medical equipment and, ominously, what looked like an incinerator. "And you've done this before?" I asked. "Tested people from outside your Imperium?" "Constantly. The Imperium incorporates new worlds regularly, conquered territories, rediscovered colonies, even entire civilizations that were previously isolated. All must be tested for taint before integration. Your situation is unusual only in its temporal displacement, not its fundamental nature." She walked me closer to the array, and I felt the hair on my arms stand up from some invisible force. Chaos is insidious, Tribune. It doesn't simply possess people like street theater demons. It corrupts gradually, planting seeds that grow over time. A man might not even know he's tainted. That's why we test everyone, always. Eternal vigilance is the price of survival. The first of my men entered the array. I recognized him. Gaius Marius, a veteran of 15 years, solid and reliable. He walked with the measured pace of a man entering battle, face neutral, posture correct, despite the obvious strangeness of the situation. The blind psychers chanting intensified. The crystals flared with light that existed in colors I couldn't quite see. Gaius stiffened, his body rigid as if struck by lightning. For 3 heartbeats he remained frozen, and I saw his face contort with some internal struggle. Then it was over. He staggered forward, caught himself, and walked out of the array looking pale but intact. "Clean," announced one of the psychers, their voice distorted by whatever power they channeled. "No taint detected. Baseline human psychic resistance within normal parameters. 1 down. 2,999 to go." The testing continued for hours. Most men passed without incident. Some vomited or collapsed from the psychic pressure but recovered quickly. My veterans maintained discipline throughout, each man facing the array without complaint or resistance. Then came the first failure. Marcus Decius, a young legionnaire who joined only a year before our displacement. He'd been a farmer's son from Aquincum, recruited to fill losses from the Dacian campaigns. Unremarkable in every way, neither the best nor the worst of my soldiers, just one of thousands who made up the legion's ranks. He entered the array, and the crystals erupted in crimson light. Decius screamed, not in pain, in ecstasy. His body convulsed, and where he stood, reality began to crack. Through the fractures, I saw something pressing against the world, trying to push through from somewhere else. Colors that had no right to exist, shapes that hurt to perceive, and eyes, thousands of eyes, staring through the cracks with malevolent hunger. "Chaos manifestation," Cassia bellowed. "Suppression teams, now!" The blind psychers shifted their chanting, and the array's tone changed from examination to attack. Pure force hammered down on Decius, crushing whatever was trying to emerge through him. He crumpled, still screaming, his voice layered with harmonics that couldn't come from a human throat. Armored figures rushed in, what they called Sisters of Battle, women warriors in power armor decorated with devotional imagery. They carried flame weapons and didn't hesitate. Within seconds, Decius was engulfed in cleansing fire. His body burned, but the screaming continued even after his lungs should have been ash. Only when one of the sisters placed a blade through his skull, a blade that glowed with its own light, did the noise finally stop. The silence that followed was broken only by my men, his shocked breathing, and the sisters' Latin prayers. Not the camp Latin we spoke, but High Gothic, the ritualistic language of their faith. "What happened to him?" I demanded, my hand on my gladius, though I knew the weapon would be useless here. "He was touched during your warp transit," Cassia said, her voice professionally clinical despite what we'd just witnessed. Probably didn't even know. The corruption was dormant, waiting for stimulus. The array activated it, forcing it to manifest so we could purge it. He was a good soldier, loyal, faithful to the gods, to our gods. "Your gods are dead or never existed," she said flatly. "There is only the Emperor now, and chaos, which seeks to corrupt and destroy all that he built. Your soldier was already lost. We simply ended it before he could spread the infection." I wanted to argue, to rail against the casual execution of one of my men, but I'd seen what was pressing through those cracks. I'd seen the eyes staring from beyond, and I understood, with sick certainty, that Cassia was right. Whatever Decius had become, it wasn't human anymore. The testing continued. We lost 6 more men to corruption over the following hours. 6 soldiers who'd served Rome faithfully, who'd survived countless campaigns, who'd done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place when reality tore apart. But 2,994 passed the screening. Nearly 3,000 Romans, who were certified clean by the Imperium's exacting standards. Your corruption rate was actually remarkably low, Cassia told me afterward, in what I think she intended as a compliment. Warp storm survivors typically show taint rates of 15 to 20%. Your 7 lost souls represent only 0.23% of your total force. Either your men are unusually resistant, or the storm that caught you was brief enough to minimize exposure. Roman discipline, I said, because I needed to believe our training and character had mattered. Mental fortitude is part of our standard training. She nodded slowly. That may actually have helped. Chaos corrupts through weakness, through doubt, fear, ambition, despair. Disciplined minds with strong identity and purpose are more resistant than average. It's why Space Marines rarely fall despite constant warp exposure. Their indoctrination and conditioning make them nearly unshakable. An idea was forming. Dangerous, probably arrogant, but Roma had never lacked for audacity. You need soldiers, I said carefully. Your Imperial Guard requires endless reinforcements to feed your eternal wars. We're trained, disciplined, tested, and proven clean. What if we retained our identity, our structure, our Roman methods, not absorbed into your guard as scattered individuals, but integrated as a unit? Cassia raised an eyebrow. You want to form a Roman legion within the Imperial Guard? Why not? You said the Imperium incorporates new worlds constantly. Surely you allow regiments to maintain cultural identity, and you admitted our discipline is advantageous. She was quiet for a long moment, considering. When she spoke, it was with the tone of someone laying out a dangerous proposal. It's possible. Imperial Guard regiments are drawn from individual worlds and maintain local traditions. The Catachan jungle fighters, the Cadian shock troops, the death corps of Krieg. Each has distinct culture, tactics, and organization. A Roman legion could theoretically fit that model. But you'd need to prove yourselves. The Imperial Guard doesn't simply accept applicants. You'd undergo training in modern weapons, tactics, and doctrine. You'd need to demonstrate effectiveness against actual Imperial standards, not ancient Earth warfare. And you'd need to accept modification to your organization. Your cohort structure would have to integrate with Imperial command hierarchies. We've adapted before, I said, thinking of how Rome had continuously evolved its military organization over centuries. We can do so again. Cassia studied me with those intense eyes. Why? Why not simply accept dissolution into existing regiments? It would be easier. Individual Romans would probably advance based on merit. Why fight to preserve a dead civilization? Because Rome never died, I said quietly. You say it fell, but ideas don't fall. Discipline doesn't fall. The principles that made Rome great, duty, honor, subordination of self to the greater good, those are eternal. If this Imperium truly claims Rome's legacy, then let us show you what that legacy actually meant before 40,000 years of war twisted it into something unrecognizable. For the first time, Cassia smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. This was a woman who burned people alive as part of her holy duty. But it was genuine. I like you, Tribune. You're idealistic and probably doomed, but I like you. I'll forward your proposal to the relevant authorities. In the meantime, your men need to be quartered, fed, and given basic orientation to Imperial society. She gestured, and a junior officer approached, someone from the administratum, by his robes. Adept Lucius will handle the practical arrangements. Your men will be housed in temporary barracks in subsector Pannonia Tertius. It's not their home, but it's built on what used to be their home 40,000 years ago. Perhaps that will provide some comfort. I doubted it, but I nodded my thanks. As we were escorted out, I looked back at the psychic array one last time. 7 of my men had died there, burned for corruption they'd never asked for and didn't deserve. 7 Romans consumed by forces they didn't understand, fighting a war they hadn't known existed. But 2,994 had survived. 2,994 Romans now existed in a galaxy that had forgotten Rome existed. we'd conquered the Mediterranean world starting with a single city and 7 hills. Could we conquer the 41st Millennium, starting with a displaced legion and unshakable faith in Roman principles? Probably not. But trying would be very Roman. Chapter 4. Eagles in the Storm. Training began at dawn, or what passed for dawn on Terra, where the sun was more memory than reality. The Departamento Munitorum had assigned us instructors from the Cadian 8th Regiment, veterans of a world called Cadia that had apparently stood as humanity's fortress against chaos for 10,000 years before finally falling in a recent catastrophe. These were hard men and women, their faces bearing scars both physical and mental, their eyes carrying the 1,000-yard stare of soldiers who'd seen too much. Our commanding instructor was Colonel Tyrus Creed, no relation to the famous Lord Castellan, he assured us, though he'd served under him. Creed stood before my assembled legion with an expression that suggested he'd rather be fighting orcs than training primitives from ancient history. "Right," he began, his accent thick with the guttural tones of his homeworld. "I'm told you lot are Romans, famous disciplined soldiers from old Terra, supposedly tough as nails, built an empire, all that. Fantastic. Doesn't mean shit in the 41st Millennium." He gestured to his own soldiers, who laid out equipment that made my legionnaires whisper in amazement. Weapons of metal and polymer that hummed with barely contained power. Armor that wasn't bronze and leather but layered ceramite designed to stop projectiles we hadn't known existed. Helmets with built-in communication systems and visual enhancements. "This is a laser gun," Creed continued, lifting a rifle-like weapon. "Standard Imperial Guard armament. Fires focused beams of light capable of burning through armor and flesh. Powered by rechargeable energy packs. Reliable, easy to maintain, devastating in massed fire. This is what you'll be learning to use," he demonstrated, pointing the weapon at a target dummy 100 meters away. A pull of the trigger, a sharp crack like lightning, and the dummy's chest exploded in a spray of melted material. My men muttered. Some made signs against evil. Not that the Christian God they'd been increasingly exposed to would recognize such gestures. The demonstration was both impressive and terrifying. No skill required, no strength needed to draw a bow or throw a pilum. Just point and destroy. "Your swords, your spears, your shields," Creed said, waving dismissively at our equipment. "Museum pieces, useless against any serious threat in this galaxy. You're going to learn modern warfare or you're going to die. Those are your options." Centurion Valerius, bless his stubborn soul, stepped forward. "We've fought for 20 years with these weapons. We've defeated barbarian hordes and Persian cavalry. Roman tactics have conquered." "Have you fought Tyranids?" Creed interrupted. 8-foot-tall bioengineered killing machines that move in swarms of thousands, that feel no fear, that adapt to overcome whatever kills them. "Have you fought orcs, who are literally fungus-based organisms that grow bigger and stronger the more they fight? Have you stood against Chaos Space Marines, traitor warriors in armor you couldn't scratch with your best ballista?" Valerius's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The answer was obviously no. "Thought not," Creed said. "So here's how this works. I'm going to teach you to soldier by Imperial standards. You're going to learn it fast, because the galaxy doesn't care about your pride or your history. When you can hold your own against a mediocre guard regiment, maybe then we'll talk about what's worth preserving from your ancient tactics." It was humiliating, but it was also necessary. The training was brutal, not because the Cadians were deliberately cruel, though some clearly enjoyed putting ancient primitives in their place, but because the stakes demanded nothing less than perfection. A single mistake with a laser gun could kill your squadmates. A single lapse in communication protocols could doom an entire platoon. The margin for error in the 41st Millennium was measured in millimeters and microseconds. My men struggled with the technology initially. Roman legionnaires were trained to fight in tight formation, shield to shield, supporting each other through physical proximity and shared discipline. Imperial Guard doctrine was different, spreading out to minimize casualties from blast weapons, using cover extensively, coordinating through electronic communication rather than visual signals. But Romans adapted. That was what we'd always done. Within a week, my men could field strip and maintain their laser guns. Within 2 weeks, they could shoot with acceptable accuracy. Within a month, they were beginning to internalize the new tactical doctrines, advancing by fire teams, using combined arms, calling in artillery support through proper channels. The Cadians began to respect us, slowly, grudgingly, but genuinely. They saw men who'd been thrown into an impossible situation and responded not with despair, but with characteristic Roman stubbornness. We drilled from before dawn until after dusk. We competed obsessively to master the new skills. We maintained our traditional discipline while absorbing new knowledge. "Your men learn faster than most guard recruits," Creed admitted to me after 6 weeks. I expected more resistance to change. Most regiments from hidebound cultures take months to adapt. Romans invented incorporation, I told him. We didn't conquer the Mediterranean by staying the same. We took the best from every enemy: Greek phalanx tactics, Spanish swords, Germanic cavalry. We see excellence and we adopt it. Your weapons are excellent. Your tactics are proven. We'd be fools not to learn. But you're keeping the Roman identity. The discipline, the structure, the values, yes, the specifics of weapons and tactics, those are just tools. Rome is bigger than any particular tool. Creed nodded slowly. I'm recommending your unit for active duty status. Pending final approval from the Departamento Munitorum, the 14th Legion will be designated as an Imperial Guard regiment. You'll be outfitted with standard equipment but allowed to maintain your organizational structure. Cohorts instead of companies, centurions instead of sergeants, that sort of thing. Victory. Or at least survival. There's one more thing, Creed said, his expression darkening. You need to understand what you're actually joining. The Imperial Guard isn't a career. It's a meat grinder. Average life expectancy for a guardsman in active combat is 15 hours. For every battle you survive, the next one is statistically more likely to kill you. You'll be deployed to the worst hellholes in the galaxy, facing enemies that would give your ancestors nightmares, and you'll die in numbers that make ancient battles look like minor skirmishes. Romans know how to die, I said quietly. Do you? Do you really? He gestured toward the sky, toward the invisible stars beyond Terra's polluted atmosphere. There are wars out there where entire regiments are wiped out in minutes. Worlds where the air itself is poisonous, where the ground tries to eat you, where reality doesn't work properly. You'll see your friends torn apart by tyrannid claws, incinerated by orc weapons, driven mad by chaos corruption, and you'll know that your death, your entire legion's death, is just a footnote in reports that will be filed and forgotten. Then why do it? I challenged. Why serve in an army where individual lives don't matter, where death is statistically certain? Creed's answer was simple and devastating. Because if we don't, humanity dies. Every guardsman who holds the line is another day humanity survives. Every battle we win is another world saved, even if just temporarily. We're not fighting to win the war. The war can't be won, not permanently. We're fighting to ensure there's still a human race that can continue fighting. It was the darkest philosophy I'd ever encountered. No promise of glory, no hope of victory, just endless war and eventual death in service of basic survival. And yet, it was Roman. Not in the propaganda of triumphal processions and legendary heroes, but in the grim pragmatism that had actually built the empire. Romans understood sacrifice. We decimated our own legions when discipline required it. We'd accepted horrific casualties in the Punic Wars because defeat meant extinction. We'd always known that civilization was expensive, paid for in blood and hardship. This imperium had taken that Roman pragmatism and amplified it to galactic scale. If we could adapt our values to their reality, if we could prove that Roman discipline still mattered, even when facing horrors beyond ancient imagination, then perhaps we could find our place in this nightmare future. When do we deploy? I asked. 3 months, Creed said. You'll undergo final integration training with Cadian units, learn combined arms operations, practice boarding actions and urban warfare. Then you'll be attached to the 17th Expeditionary Fleet as a rapid response force. What's the mission? Officially, pacification of newly compliant worlds in the Ultima Segmentum. Unofficially, he smiled grimly. You'll be fighting orcs, most likely. Maybe Tyranids if you're unlucky. Possibly Chaos Cultists if you're very unlucky. The Imperium is pushing into territory reclaimed after the Great Rift closed, and there's all sorts of nasty surprises waiting there. The Great Rift. I'd learned about it during our orientation. A massive warp storm that had split the galaxy in half for over a century of subjective time, though temporal distortion meant the duration varied wildly by location. It had only recently been sealed, and now the Imperium was racing to reclaim lost territory before xenos or chaos could fully establish themselves. We'll be ready, I promised, and we were. 3 months of intensive training transformed my legion from displaced ancient soldiers into a functional Imperial Guard regiment. We learned to fight in void operations, in toxic atmospheres, in zero gravity. We practiced combined assaults with armored vehicles and aircraft. We studied the enemies we'd face, their biology, their tactics, their weaknesses, but we remained Romans. Every morning, we raised our eagle standard and offered prayers, no longer to Mars or Jupiter, but adapted to the Emperor, whom the Imperium insisted we venerate as divine. Every evening, we maintained formation drill, keeping the cohort structure intact, even as we integrated Imperial squad tactics. Every moment, we reminded each other who we were and where we'd come from. On the day before deployment, I stood before the entire Legion in our new armor. Flak armor, bearing both Imperial Aquilas and Roman Eagles helmets that incorporated communication gear with design elements reminiscent of our old bronze helms lace guns, modified with bayonets styled after gladii. Brothers, I said, using the term with full awareness of its weight. Tomorrow we leave Terra. Tomorrow we enter the galaxy as soldiers of the Imperium. But we do so as Romans. We carry forward the values that made Rome eternal. Discipline, courage, loyalty, self-sacrifice. The galaxy may be darker than any world our ancestors knew, but Romans have always brought light to darkness, civilization to barbarity, order to chaos. I raised my gladius, the actual ancient weapon, which I'd been permitted to keep as a ceremonial sidearm. The eagle endures, Rome endures, and by the Emperor's will, we will prove that Roman virtue can survive even the horrors of the 41st Millennium. The response shook the walls. Roma invicta, Roma aeterna, Rome unconquered, Rome eternal. Whether we believed it or were simply refusing to accept defeat, I couldn't say. But we marched onto the transport ships the next day with our heads high and our eagle standard flying proudly. Ancient Rome was about to fight its first battle in the 41st Millennium. We had no idea if we'd survive it, but we'd face it as Romans had always faced the impossible, with discipline, with courage, and with the absolute refusal to surrender while a single legionnaire still drew breath. Chapter 5. Blood on Alien Soil. The world was called Tertius Majoris, and it was dying. We'd made the journey through the warp, an experience I'd rather not describe in detail, as even with proper Geller fields protecting the ship, I'd felt the immaterium pressing against reality like water against a dam. The whispers were constant, promising impossible things, showing visions that made no sense but felt terrifyingly real. I understood why chaos corruption was such a threat. The warp was antithetical to sanity. Tertius Majoris had been an imperial world before the Great Rift. Now it was contested territory. Orcs had landed 6 months ago, drawn by the conflict like sharks to blood in water. The xenos had overwhelmed the planetary defense forces and were now spreading across the surface like a green plague. Our mission was simple in concept, horrifying in execution. Establish a beachhead, link up with surviving Imperial forces, and hold until reinforcements arrived to push the orcs off-world. Expected casualties, 70% over a 3-month campaign. The drop was my first experience with Imperial Guard assault doctrine. We descended in Valkyrie dropships, armored aircraft that screamed through the atmosphere while enemy fire tried to swat us from the sky. I watched through the transport's viewports as other Valkyries were hit, exploding in mid-air or spiraling down to crash in fiery ruin. "Brace for landing!" the pilot shouted through our helmet comms. We hit the ground hard. The rear ramp dropped, and my cohort poured out into a nightmare. Orcs. I'd seen the images during training, but nothing prepared me for the reality. They stood 8 feet tall on average, green-skinned mountains of muscle and brutal violence. They wore crude armor decorated with their own brutal iconography, all jagged teeth and bloodstains. And their weapons, Emperor save us, their weapons. They wielded guns that looked like they'd been assembled from scrap metal and pure aggression. These choppers and shooters shouldn't have functioned based on any engineering principles I understood, but they did function, throwing out crude but devastatingly effective firepower. "Open fire!" I roared, and 300 lasguns answered. The training paid off immediately. My men, arranged in modified testudo formation that allowed individual fire while maintaining defensive cohesion, poured las fire into the approaching orc mob. The beams burned through orc flesh, dropping dozens, but the xenos didn't stop, didn't slow, didn't show fear. They charged, bellowing what I'd later learn was their war cry. Wah! The impact was like a tidal wave hitting a seawall. Orcs crashed into our formation with axes and cleavers and massive fists that could crush plasteel. My front rank went down, Romans dying under brutal alien assault. But we didn't break. "Second rank, advance. First rank, recover and fire," Centurion Valerius commanded, and the Legion responded with practiced precision. Men stepped over their fallen comrades, established new firing lines, continued pouring las fire into the enemy, while those who'd been knocked down regained their feet and joined the fight. I drew my chainsword, a modern weapon that married Roman aesthetics with imperial effectiveness, its motorized teeth screaming as I activated it. An orc crashed toward me, all muscle and violence and stinking alien flesh. I sidestepped its clumsy overhead swing and carved my chainsword through its leg. The blade bit deep, teeth grinding through orc tissue, green blood spraying. The xenos toppled, roaring in rage and pain. I ended it with a thrust through its throat. No glory, no honor, just necessary killing. The battle raged for 2 hours. We held our ground through discipline and massed firepower, the classic Roman principle of mutual support, adapted to weapons our ancestors couldn't have imagined. When orcs broke through the line, we responded with calculated brutality, killing teams moving in coordinated fashion to bring down the larger xenos through combined fire. When the xenos finally withdrew, I learned they never truly retreated, just regrouped to attack elsewhere. We'd lost 47 men, 47 Romans who'd survived 40,000 years of temporal displacement, only to die on an alien world against xenos monsters. But we'd held. Against a force that outnumbered us 3-1, we'd held. "Status report," I called out, moving through the cohort. Valerius appeared, his armor scored by orc weapons but intact. First and second cohorts established defensive perimeter. Third cohort, linking up with survivors from another guard regiment, looks like Cadian remnants. Fourth and fifth cohorts securing the landing zone. Casualties across all units approximately 15%. Could have been worse. Could have been worse. That was the standard by which success was measured in the 41st Millennium. The Cadian commander found me an hour later, Major Helena Cast, her face bearing the same 1,000-yard stare I'd seen in all veterans of this era, approached with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "You're the Romans," she said, without preamble. "I'd heard about you. Thought it was a joke. Ancient soldiers trying to fight orcs with swords and shields." "We adapted," I said simply, gesturing to the lasburns and orc blood covering my armor. "I see that." She studied my men, who were maintaining defensive positions while tending to wounded and reloading power packs with impressive efficiency. "Your discipline is remarkable. I've seen veteran regiments fold under their first orc assault. You held formation throughout." "Romans know formation. We built an empire on fighting as one rather than as individuals. Cass nodded slowly. That'll serve you well. In the Guard, individual heroics mean nothing. It's unit cohesion that wins battles. She paused. I'm establishing a joint command post 3 kilometers north, near the ruins of an imperial shrine. Your legion would anchor our left flank. Interested? We're here to fight. Location doesn't matter. Over the following weeks, we fought across Tertius Majoris in a grinding campaign that made the Punic Wars look restrained. The orcs were relentless, attacking in mobs that seemed to grow larger every day. We learned that orcs released spores when they died, and those spores eventually grew into new orcs. The xenos were literally self-replicating biological weapons, but we adapted again. We learned to identify orc leadership. The bigger they were, the more authority they held. Take out the knob leading a mob, and the rest became disorganized. We learned to anticipate orc tactics, such as they were. The xenos preferred direct assault, which actually played to Roman strengths in disciplined defense. Most importantly, we learned to integrate with other imperial units. The Cadians taught us advanced fire support coordination. A Mordian regiment showed us how to maintain formation in urban environments. Even the Space Marines, who occasionally appeared to deal with the largest orc concentrations, acknowledged our effectiveness. You fight well for primitives, one Ultramarine told me, after a particularly brutal engagement where we'd held a critical bridge against 3 separate orc assaults. There was no irony in his voice. He meant it as a genuine compliment. Romans aren't primitive, I replied. We're foundational. There's a difference. 2 months into the campaign, I stood on a hilltop overlooking the battlefield where we'd broken the orcs' main offensive. Bodies covered the ground, mostly orcs, but too many humans. Romans and Cadians and Mordians and soldiers from a dozen other regiments, all of them dead in service of holding one insignificant world in a galaxy of millions. Was it worth it? Valerius asked quietly. He'd been with me since the beginning, survived the temporal displacement and every battle since. All these dead, all this suffering. For what? I thought about that question, about the Imperium's grim calculus where planets were expendable, armies were consumable, individual lives meant nothing against the vast scale of galactic war. If we don't hold here, the orcs take Tertius Majoris, I finally said. If they take this world, they use it as a staging ground to attack others. Each world that falls makes the next easier to conquer. Eventually, the wave reaches worlds with billions of civilians who can't defend themselves. So yes, it's worth it. Not because this specific world matters, but because every world matters as part of the larger whole. That's very Roman of you. That's why Rome survived for centuries when other civilizations collapsed. We understood that civilization requires sacrifice, that someone has to stand on the wall so others can sleep safely. Valerius nodded slowly. The Imperium's taken that principle and turned it into something monstrous. But the principle itself, that's still valid. Yes, which means we can work within this system, can improve it even, by showing them what Roman virtue actually meant before it got twisted into their cult of the Emperor. The campaign on Tertius Majoris lasted 4 months total. We lost 612 men, more than 20% of our original force, but we'd held every position assigned to us. We'd proven that ancient Roman discipline could function in the 41st Millennium. We'd earned respect from regiments that had initially dismissed us as a historical curiosity. And we'd survived. The 14th Legion had fought its first campaign in the future and emerged bloodied, but intact. As we boarded the transport ships to leave Tertius Majoris, I looked back at the world one final time. It was scarred, damaged, depopulated. But it remained imperial, remained human. That had to count for something. Where next? Centurion Valerius asked. Wherever the Imperium sends us, that's the bargain we made. Think we'll survive long enough to make a real difference? I looked at my remaining men, scarred now, no longer the pristine ancients who'd emerged from the warp storm, but hardened veterans who'd proven themselves against the galaxy's horrors. We're Romans, I said simply. We'll survive as long as it takes to prove our value. And then we'll survive longer out of sheer stubbornness." Valerius laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from him in months. Very Roman indeed. The transport ship broke orbit, carrying us away from Tertius Majoris toward whatever fresh hell the Imperium would deploy us to next. But we went willingly, because for all its cruelty, for all its darkness, the Imperium was fighting for humanity's survival. And if Romans could help tilt the scales even slightly towards survival, then our displacement 40,000 years into the future might have purpose after all. The eagle endured. Rome endured. And in the 41st Millennium, that was its own kind of victory. Chapter 6. Integration and Identity. 1 year after our arrival in the 41st Millennium, the 14th Legion had become something I didn't fully recognize. We'd fought on 7 worlds, survived campaigns against orcs, chaos cultists, and a brief encounter with the Tyranids that still gave me nightmares. Biomechanical horror that consumed everything and moved with hive mind coordination that made Roman tactical discipline look amateur by comparison. Our numbers had fluctuated. We'd lost nearly 1,000 men to combat, but the Imperium had provided replacements. Not other displaced Romans, those were gone, consumed or adapted, but recruits from imperial worlds who chose to join what had become known as the Roman Regiment, or, more formally, the 14th Imperial Legion. These new men weren't from ancient Rome. They were from worlds we'd never heard of, cultures we didn't understand, but they wanted to be Romans. They learned our language, adopted our discipline, swore oaths to the Legion rather than just the Imperium. It was simultaneously touching and troubling. "We're becoming something new," Valerius observed during a quiet moment between campaigns. We were stationed on a naval vessel in transit to our next deployment, using the time to integrate fresh recruits. Not the Romans who came through the warp storm, not fully Imperial Guard either. Something in between. I watched a training session where ancient Romans drilled alongside recruits from Cadia, from Talon, from Vostroia. They moved in cohort formation, carried lasguns and chainswords, wore armor that blended Roman aesthetics with imperial function. They chanted in Latin, not the Latin of Rome, but a hybrid mixing classical grammar with imperial Gothic vocabulary. "Is that bad?" I asked. "I don't know. We came here wanting to preserve Rome, to show the Imperium what Roman virtue meant. But Rome is changing in the process. In a few generations, will anyone remember actual Rome? Or will Roman just mean a particular fighting style in the Imperial Guard?" It was a valid concern. Already, some of our original legionnaires had died, their places taken by men who'd never seen ancient Rome, who knew our history only through second-hand stories. The culture was evolving, adapting, becoming something that served the Imperium's needs rather than preserving authentic Roman tradition. But wasn't that always what Rome did? Rome conquered the Mediterranean by incorporating others, I reminded Valerius. We gave citizenship to Gauls, to Iberians, to Africans, to Greeks. They became Romans not through bloodline, but through adoption of Roman values. Why should this be different? Because those people lived on the same world, shared the same basic humanity. These recruits come from worlds so different, they might as well be different species. Some grew up in zero-gravity habitats. Others never saw the sky because they lived in underhive tunnels. They're human, technically, but they're not our kind of human. I thought about that, about how human had become such a flexible category in the 41st Millennium. I'd met people with augmetic limbs, with genetic modifications, with neural implants that let them interface directly with machines. I'd seen abhuman populations, squats, ratlings, ogrins, that were technically human, but diverged significantly from baseline biology. And yet, the Imperium held it all together, bound 1,000,000 worlds and quadrillions of souls into a single, barely functional civilization that had endured for 10,000 years. Maybe that's the lesson, I said slowly. Rome's value isn't in a specific time or place. It's in the principles, discipline, duty, civic virtue, sacrifice for the greater good. If we can pass those principles forward, Even if the people and culture change, then Rome survives in spirit, if not in form. Valerius didn't look convinced, but he nodded. We both knew we didn't have a choice. The original Romans would die out eventually. Either we evolved and incorporated others, or we disappeared entirely. That evening, I met with my senior officers, a mix of original Romans and promising new recruits who'd earned promotion through merit. We discussed the Legion's future, and I made a decision that would have scandalized traditionalists, but felt right given our circumstances. We're opening recruitment beyond just Imperial Guard washouts, I announced. From now on, anyone who wishes to join the 14th Legion and meets our standards can do so. We'll train them in Roman methods, indoctrinate them in Roman values, and integrate them into our cohorts. Within 2 generations, we'll be a fully multi-world regiment that happens to fight Roman style rather than a group of displaced ancients pretending 40,000 years haven't passed. Some of the original Romans looked betrayed, but most nodded in understanding. They'd seen enough of the galaxy to know that purity was impossible, that survival required adaptation. What about our culture? Asked Marcus Decius. Not the original Decius who died in the chaos testing, but a recruit from Cadia who'd adopted the name. If we're just going to become another Imperial regiment with different uniforms, what's the point? The culture remains, I assured him. We speak Latin. We maintain cohort structure. We drill with gladi even though we fight with lasguns. We honor our eagle standard. We study the campaigns of Caesar and Scipio alongside imperial tactical doctrine. But we accept that culture evolves. Rome in 235 AD was different from Rome in 100 BC, which was different from Rome in 500 BC. Evolution isn't death, it's survival. The vote was split, but ultimately supportive. The 14th Legion would continue, would grow, would adapt. We'd remain recognizably Roman while accepting that Roman could include people who'd never set foot on Terra before its transformation into a hive world. Over the following months, our new policy bore fruit. Recruits from across the Imperium requested transfer to the Roman regiment. Some came because they'd heard of our discipline and wanted that structure. Others came because they admired the historical legacy. A few came because they were misfits in their original regiments and hoped for fresh starts. We didn't accept everyone. Roman discipline required certain qualities: mental toughness, ability to subordinate individual desires to group needs, willingness to endure hardship without complaint. But those who made it through selection became Romans in every way that mattered. I met one such recruit, a woman named Octavia from a world called Praetoria. She'd served in the Praetorian Guard, no relation to Rome's original Praetorians despite the name, and requested transfer after hearing about our legion. Why? I asked during her interview. The Praetorians have an excellent reputation. Why leave them for an experimental unit? Because you're trying to build something, she said simply. The regular guard fights and dies and gets replaced. Individual regiments don't matter. We're just ammunition for the Imperium's wars. But you're trying to create an identity, a legacy, something that might outlast individual soldiers. That's worth being part of. She became one of our best centurions. Within a year, she'd proven herself in combat against Tyranids and trained 2 full cohorts in Roman methods. Her troops were a mix of displaced Romans, Cadian transfers, and fresh recruits from a dozen worlds. But they fought as Romans, moved as Romans, died as Romans. The administratum took notice. We'd proven effective enough that other regiments began requesting Roman-style training. The Departamento Munitorum published manuals on our tactics. Some Imperial Guard commanders criticized us as overly rigid, but others recognized that our discipline produced consistently reliable results. We weren't the most effective regiment in the Guard. Space Marines were far superior, and specialized units like Catachans or Kriegers had their own advantages. But we were solid, dependable, and we maintained effectiveness even in situations where other regiments broke down. 2 years after arriving in the 41st Millennium, I stood before the entire Legion, now grown to 4,000 through recruitment, and reflected on what we'd become. We were Romans, yes, but we were also products of the Imperium. We fought with lasguns and believed in the Emperor. We included soldiers from 100 worlds who'd never known ancient Rome. We'd adapted, evolved, changed, and yet the core remained. Discipline, duty, sacrifice. The Eagle Standard still flew, Latin was still spoken, the old campaigns were still studied. We were recognizably descended from the legion that had emerged from the warp storm. Brothers and sisters, I addressed them, because yes, we now included women, another adaptation that ancient Rome would have rejected, but the Imperium required. We've survived 2 years in the 41st Millennium. We've proven that Roman virtue can endure even in the darkest future. But we've also learned that survival requires change. I gestured to the mixed assembly before me. Look around. You come from different worlds, different backgrounds, different traditions. But you're all Romans now. You've earned that through discipline, through courage, through refusal to break under pressure. And that's what Rome always was. Not a bloodline, but a choice. The choice to uphold certain values, regardless of cost. The speech was well received. We were finding our identity, not as displaced ancients pretending the universe hadn't changed, but as a living tradition that adapted while maintaining its core. The Imperium was cruel, darkly pragmatic, willing to sacrifice billions for strategic gain, but it was also humanity's last, best hope. And if Romans could help it survive, could remind it that discipline and virtue mattered even in the grinding machinery of endless war, then perhaps our displacement 40,000 years forward had purpose. We were Rome's children, scattered across time and space, but we endured. The eagle endured. And as long as even one Roman drew breath, Rome itself would never truly fall. Chapter 7. Roman Virtues in an Inhuman Galaxy. By the 5th year of our existence in the 41st Millennium, the 14th Legion had developed a reputation. We were the stubborn bastards who refused to break. The Legion that would hold any position assigned, regardless of casualties, until relieved or dead. Commands that needed a line, held without question, requested us specifically. We became the anvil around which more mobile forces maneuvered. It was a grim distinction, but it was earned through blood and validated by results. The campaign on Hive-World Kratos demonstrated what we'd become. Chaos cultists had seized 3 Hive cities, threatening to turn the entire world into a demon-infested nightmare. The Imperium's response was overwhelming. 3 full regiments of Imperial Guard, supported by Sisters of Battle and a company of Space Marines from the Iron Hands chapter. The 14th Legion was assigned to hold the main arterial highway connecting the largest hive to Imperial-controlled territory. It was a killing ground, 40 kilometers of elevated roadway with no cover, overlooked by hive structures controlled by enemies. Any force trying to hold it would be subjected to constant fire from multiple directions. "This is a suicide mission," Centurion Octavia said bluntly during the briefing. "They're sending us to die so other forces can maneuver without harassment." "Probably," I agreed. "Does that change anything?" She smiled grimly. "Not really. Romans have held worse positions. We deployed with 3 cohorts, 1,200 soldiers to hold 40 kilometers against an enemy force estimated at 10,000. The mathematics were brutal, but mathematics had never stopped Romans before. We established defense in depth, using the elevated roadways structure to create layered positions. When the cultists attacked, and they attacked within hours of our arrival, we met them with massed lasgun fire and absolute refusal to yield ground. The first day, we lost 200 men. The second day, 300 more. By the third day, we were down to 500 effectives, and the cultists were pressing hard, sensing weakness. That's when the Imperium's true plan became clear. While we'd been bleeding the enemy, other forces had maneuvered around the cultists' positions. Space Marines hit their command structure. Sisters of Battle purged their ritual sites, and 2 guard regiments drove into their rear areas. We'd been the bait. The sacrifice that bought time and attention for the real strike. It should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like validation. This was what Rome had always done. accept the hardest duties, endure the worst casualties, hold the line so others could win the battle. When relief finally arrived, I had 317 survivors out of 1,200, 62% casualties. By Imperial standards, that was acceptable for a holding action. By Roman standards, it was Tuesday. The after-action report praised our exemplary discipline and dedication to duty. The Departamento Munitorum noted our effectiveness as an anchoring force. The Space Marine captain who'd led the assault personally commended our performance. But I stood among the survivors and wondered how long we could sustain such losses. We could recruit. The Roman regiment's reputation now attracted volunteers. But training took time. Each campaign consumed experienced veterans and replaced them with green troops who hadn't yet learned what it meant to be Roman. "We're being ground down," Valerius said quietly. He was one of the few original Romans still alive, his face now bearing more scars than unmarked skin. Not destroyed in a single battle, but gradually eroded through constant deployment to the hardest assignments. "That's the price of reputation," I replied. "We're effective, so we're used. That's how the Imperium works." Is it worth it? All these dead, all this sacrifice, for an empire that sees us as consumable tools? I thought about that question often, about the Romans who'd come through the warp storm with me. How few remained. About the recruits who'd joined us, seeking something meaningful, finding only brutal service and likely death. About whether preserving Roman identity mattered when the Imperium would eventually consume us regardless. But I kept coming back to the same answer. Someone had to stand on the wall. If not us, then who? "The Imperium is cruel," I said slowly. "But it's fighting for humanity's survival against things that would exterminate or enslave our entire species. I've seen tyrannids that would consume every human in the galaxy as biomass. I've seen chaos demons that would damn every soul to eternal torment. I've seen orc hordes that would crush human civilization because they find war entertaining. Against those threats, the Imperium's cruelty is necessary." You sound like you've been indoctrinated. Maybe I have. Or maybe I've just seen enough to understand that when the choice is between surviving as slaves to a harsh system or dying to forces that show no mercy whatsoever, you choose survival. And then you try to make the system better from within. That became our new mission. Not just surviving, but improving. We started small, with how we treated our own troops. Roman discipline was harsh but fair. Officers ate the same rations as common soldiers. Punishment was standardized, not arbitrary. Merit determined promotion, not favoritism. It seemed minor. But in an imperial guard where officers often lived luxuriously while soldiers starved, where brutal punishment was standard, where noble-born officers treated common troops as expendable, our approach was revolutionary. Other regiments noticed. Some requested advisors to help implement Roman disciplinary methods. Others requested our centurions as trainers. The Departamento Munitorum noted decreased desertion rates and increased combat effectiveness in units that adopted Roman principles. We couldn't change the Imperium, but we could change our corner of it. I met with an inquisitor, a different one from Cassia who'd tested us initially, during a strategic planning session. Lord Inquisitor Matthias of the Ordo Xenos was investigating orc movements in our sector and wanted input from ground commanders who'd fought them extensively. "Your legion interests me," he said after the briefing. "You're temporal displacement survivors who've not just adapted, but thrived. You've maintained identity while integrating into the Imperial Guard, and you've demonstrated consistent effectiveness against multiple xenos threats. I'm curious about your secret." "No secret," I replied. "Just Roman discipline and willingness to learn from mistakes." Deeper than that, I think. He studied me with eyes that had seen too much. "You came from a time when humanity was united in a single empire on a single world, when wars were between human factions, not existential struggles against alien civilizations. That should have made you weak, unprepared for the scale of violence you've encountered. Instead, you've become one of the more reliable guard regiments in the sector. Why?" I considered how to explain it. Rome was built on practicality. We believed in discipline, But we also believed in adapting to circumstances. When we encountered the Greek phalanx, we studied it and improved on it. When we faced Carthaginian tactics, we learned from them. We weren't rigid traditionalists. We were aggressive learners who maintained core values while constantly evolving methods. And the Imperium has forgotten that adaptation matters. You've turned into rigid adherence to doctrine, killing innovation and suppressing change because you're terrified that any deviation might lead to chaos corruption. It's understandable given the threats you face, but it's also limiting. You've sacrificed efficiency for security. I expected anger at my critique. Instead, Matthias nodded thoughtfully. And you think you can change that? In small ways. One legion showing that discipline doesn't require brutality, that you can maintain loyalty without crushing independent thought, that soldiers who understand why they're fighting perform better than ones motivated only by fear. Dangerous ideas, Matthias observed, the kind that could be seen as sedition or common sense. Depends on perspective. He smiled slightly. I like you, Tribune. You're idealistic but not naive. You understand the Imperium's darkness but still believe improvement is possible. That's rare. He paused. I'm authorizing additional resources for your legion. Better equipment, priority for recruits, access to specialist training. I want to see if your Roman experiment can scale beyond a single regiment. It was validation, acknowledgement that what we were building mattered. Over the following year, we expanded. Not numerically, we remained a single legion-strength regiment, but in influence. Our training methods spread to other units. Our disciplinary codes were studied by commissars looking for alternatives to execution as the default punishment. Our tactical doctrines were analyzed by strategists. We were becoming more than just another guard regiment. We were becoming an example of what the Imperium could be if it remembered that humans responded better to fairness than fear. It wouldn't save the Imperium, wouldn't stop the endless wars or eliminate chaos corruption or defeat the xenos threats. But it might make the soldiers who died in those wars feel like their service mattered, might give them pride in their units rather than just fear of execution, might remind the Imperium that humanity was worth fighting for, not just worth consuming. And that, I decided, was Roman enough. We'd come from an empire that built roads and aqueducts and laws alongside its conquests, that believed in spreading civilization, not just extracting resources. If we could remind the Imperium of that principle, then our displacement 40,000 years forward had served a purpose beyond mere survival. The eagle endured, Rome endured, and perhaps, just perhaps, the 41st Millennium could learn something from the ancient past about how to build a future worth fighting for. Chapter 8. Rome Eternal. 10 years after emerging from the warp storm, I stood on a battlefield that would determine the 14th Legion's legacy. The world was Palatine 4, strategically vital and under assault by a massive chaos incursion. 3 traitor legions of Chaos Space Marines, the damned cousins of the loyalist Astartes, had descended upon the planet with millions of cultists in support. The Imperium's response mobilized 10 guard regiments, 2 loyalist Space Marine chapters, and the full military might of the planet's own defense forces. The 14th Legion was assigned to defend Palatine City's eastern approaches. It was a critical position. If we broke, the entire defensive line would collapse and the city would fall. We now numbered 6,000, grown through constant recruitment and training. Most were not original Romans, but they were Romans nonetheless, shaped by our culture, our discipline, our values. They spoke Latin, followed our tactical doctrines, honored the Eagle standard. They were the living proof that Rome could survive even 40,000 years of change. The assault began at dawn. Chaos cultists came first, waves of corrupted humans throwing themselves at our lines with fanatical courage and twisted faith. We cut them down with massed laser-gun fire. The disciplined volleys that had made Roman armies legendary now applied to energy weapons. But the cultists were just the softening attack. Behind them came the real threat. Chaos Space Marines. They were giants, even larger than loyalist Astartes, their armor warped by millennia of warp exposure. They carried weapons that screamed with demonic power, moved with predatory grace despite their bulk, and radiated corruption that made my soul hurt to perceive. Hold the line, I roared, knowing that breaking now meant not just death but damnation. For the Emperor and Rome, the response came from 6,000 throats. Roma invicta, Roma aeterna. The Chaos Marines hit our position like a sledgehammer. Our defensive structures, bunkers and trenches built with Roman engineering principles adapted to Imperial materials, absorbed the first impact. Laser guns that would bounce harmlessly off their armor concentrated fire, overwhelming their defenses through sheer volume. But they were transhuman warriors, each worth 100 normal soldiers. They carved through my men with chain axes and bolt pistols, their centuries of combat experience making them practically unstoppable. We stopped them anyway, not through superior firepower. We were massively outmatched in that regard, but through discipline and coordination. My centurions directed overlapping fields of fire, concentrated plasma and melter weapons on priority targets, called in artillery support with Roman precision. When Chaos Marines broke through the line, we responded with prepared kill zones, positions where concentrated firepower could be brought to bear from multiple angles. When they tried to use their mobility to flank, they found secondary positions already manned and ready. We traded space for casualties, conducting a fighting withdrawal that bled them for every meter while maintaining unit cohesion. It was classic Roman warfare, accepting inevitable losses while ensuring those losses achieved strategic objectives. The battle lasted 17 hours. By the end, I had 3,000 survivors out of 6,000, 50% casualties. The defensive line had held, but barely. I found Centurion Octavia in a medical station, her left arm a mangled ruin being tended by chirurgeons. She looked up as I approached, managed a weak smile. "We held," she said simply. "We held," I confirmed. "At considerable cost. That's what Romans do. We pay the price that needs paying." She was right, and I hated that she was right. In the aftermath, as we counted the dead and prepared for the next assault, I received a summons from the overall Imperial commander, a Space Marine captain from the Ultramarines, that chapter which claimed to be Rome's spiritual descendants. Captain Tiberius Sulla met me in his command post, a massive warrior whose armor bore honors from campaigns I couldn't begin to count. He studied me with eyes that had witnessed centuries of warfare. "Tribune Corvus," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a being of such power. "I've reviewed your legion's performance. Your casualties were severe, but you held against overwhelming force. That's worthy of respect." "We did our duty," I replied simply. "More than that, you demonstrated Roman virtue in its truest form. Steadfastness under pressure, discipline in chaos, willingness to sacrifice for the greater good." He paused. "My chapter claims descent from Rome's ideals. We study ancient Terra's history, model our organization on Roman military structure, honor the legacy of classical civilization. But I wonder if we've lost something in 40,000 years of warfare, if we've turned Rome's practicality into rigid dogma. What are you suggesting? That perhaps we should be learning from you, rather than just acknowledging your service. Your legion maintains discipline without brutality, inspires loyalty through respect rather than fear, adapts ancient principles to modern circumstances. These are lessons the Imperium needs." He activated a hololith display showing strategic data. "I'm recommending your legion for expansion, not just in numbers but in mission scope. The Departamento Munitorum agrees that your methods produce results. We want to create more Roman-style regiments, train them according to your principles, spread your approach across the Guard." It was everything I'd hoped for and simultaneously terrifying. Success at scale meant responsibility. It meant our methods would be tested against the full horror of the galaxy. It meant that if we failed, if Roman discipline proved insufficient against the darkness, it would discredit everything we'd built. What would this expansion entail? I asked carefully. Multiple regiments, each trained in Roman methods. You'd provide the officers and the doctrine. The Imperium would provide the troops and equipment. Within a generation, we could have 50,000 soldiers fighting as Romans. Within a century, that number could grow exponentially. 50,000 Romans. The thought was dizzying. Rome at its height had fielded armies of that size. Now we might do so again, 40,000 years after Rome's fall. But would they really be Romans? Or would they just be Imperial Guard wearing Roman aesthetics? "I have conditions," I said. Tiberius raised an eyebrow. Bold, for a tribune addressing a Space Marine captain. "I've earned some boldness. First condition, we maintain Latin as our command language. Not Gothic with Latin words, but actual Latin. It's part of what makes us distinct." Acceptable. Second condition, we control our own training and officer selection. The Imperium provides recruits, but we shape them into Romans. No interference from commissars or Munitorum bureaucrats who don't understand what we're building. That's politically difficult, but I can arrange it. Third, we honor the fallen appropriately. Roman legionaries who die in service deserve Roman funerals, not mass cremation and numerical filing. Their names are recorded, their deeds are remembered, their sacrifice is acknowledged. Tiberius was silent for a long moment. That last one may be impossible. The Imperium processes billions of casualties. Individual commemoration isn't practical. Then we do it ourselves. We maintain our own records, hold our own ceremonies, remember our own dead. If the Imperium won't honor them, we will. He considered, then nodded slowly. Agreed, all three conditions. The Roman expansion is approved. Over the following months, I witnessed the birth of something remarkable. Recruits poured in from across the Imperium, volunteers who'd heard of the Roman regiment and wanted to be part of something that valued individual soldiers. We trained them in cohort tactics, taught them Latin, indoctrinated them in Roman virtues. We formed the 2 Legion, then the 3rd, then more. Each was led by centurions who'd proven themselves in the 14th, who understood what it meant to be Roman in the 41st Millennium. Each maintained the standards we'd established: discipline without brutality, loyalty earned through respect, constant adaptation within a framework of core principles. By the end of my 10th year in the 41st Millennium, 30,000 Romans served across 5 legions. It was a fraction of the Imperium's military might. Billions of guards served across the galaxy, but it was a start. More importantly, we were changing how the Guard operated. Other regiments adopted our training methods. Commissars studied our disciplinary codes. Strategists analyzed our tactical successes and recommended similar approaches. We weren't conquering the galaxy, but we were influencing it. 15 years after emerging from the warp storm, I received news that I'd been promoted to legate commander, given authority over all Roman legions. It was a rank that hadn't existed in the Imperial Guard before. The Imperium was literally creating new organizational structures to accommodate what we'd built. I was now 63 years old, impossibly ancient for a Guard officer who'd spent 15 years in active combat. Most officers died within months of frontline deployment. Survival measured in years was extraordinary. Survival measured in decades was nearly unheard of. But Romans were stubborn. We refused to die when we still had work to do. I stood before a memorial wall listing every Roman who'd fallen in service since our arrival. The names numbered in the thousands, each one representing a life cut short in the Imperium's endless wars. Some were original Romans from the warp storm. Most were recruits who'd chosen to become Roman, who'd died defending principles they'd adopted rather than inherited. Centurion Valerius joined me at the wall. He was the last surviving original Roman besides myself, his body more scar than skin, his mind still sharp despite decades of horror. Was it worth it? He asked, echoing his question from years before. All these dead, all this suffering. Did we prove what we set out to prove? I thought about that question, about the legion that had emerged terrified from a warp storm, facing a nightmare future, about how we'd adapted, survived, grown, about the 30,000 Romans now serving across the galaxy, each one a testament to ancient principles applied to modern warfare. We proved that Rome's values are eternal, I said slowly, that discipline and duty and sacrifice aren't artifacts of a dead civilization, but timeless human virtues. The Imperium is still cruel, still grinding, still consuming its own. But there are 30,000 soldiers who fight with pride instead of just fear, who believe their service matters, who remember that humanity is worth fighting for. That's not the empire we left. No. But it's the empire we can build within, one legion at a time, one soldier at a time, teaching the 41st Millennium that strength doesn't require cruelty, that efficiency doesn't require brutality, that the emperor's will is best served by inspiring loyalty rather than demanding obedience. Valerius nodded slowly. Very Roman of you, conquering through cultural influence rather than direct force. It's what we always did best. That night, I wrote a letter to be delivered after my inevitable death in battle. It was addressed to whoever led the Roman legions next, offering advice gleaned from 15 years of service in the Imperium's endless wars. The core message was simple: adapt, but never surrender. Change methods, but preserve principles. Accept that culture evolves, but fight to ensure it evolves toward light rather than darkness. Rome had survived 40,000 years by dying and being reborn in new forms. The Imperium claimed Rome's legacy. The Ultramarines honored Rome's structure. We were becoming Rome's latest iteration. Could ancient Rome survive the 41st millennium? The answer was complicated. The literal Rome of 235 AD couldn't survive unchanged. But Rome's spirit, its discipline, its adaptability, its fundamental belief that civilization required sacrifice, and that sacrifice earned honor, that could not only survive, but flourish. We were Romans. We endured. We adapted. We conquered not through force alone, but through demonstrating that our way produced results. And in the darkness of the 41st millennium, where hope was heresy and optimism was foolish, we dared to believe that ancient virtues still mattered. The eagle endured. Rome endured. And as long as even one soldier stood formation with a gladius at their side and Latin on their lips, Rome would never truly fall. Roma invicta. Roma eterna. Rome was unconquered. Rome is eternal. 20 years after emerging from the warp storm, I returned to Terra for what I knew would be the final time. The Imperium had summoned me, not for punishment or interrogation, but for recognition. The Roman legions had grown to 10 full regiments numbering 80,000 soldiers. We'd fought on 100 worlds, held lines that others abandoned, proven that ancient discipline could match modern threats. The Lord Commander of the Imperium himself wanted to meet the man who'd started it all. I walked through the Imperial Palace with an escort of custodians, the Emperor's personal guards, golden giants who made Space Marines look almost human by comparison. The architecture around me was both familiar and alien. I recognized Roman influences in the columns and arches, but they'd been scaled up to inhuman proportions and layered with 10,000 years of Gothic excess. "You seem troubled, Legate Commander," one of the custodians observed. His name was Valdor's heir, and he'd introduced himself with that title rather than a personal name, as if individual identity was secondary to his function. "I'm seeing Rome's legacy," I said quietly, "but I'm not sure Rome would recognize it. You've taken our symbols, the eagles, the Latin, the organizational structure, but you've stripped away the Republican ideals. You've made the worst of Rome eternal while forgetting what made Rome worth remembering. The Emperor preserved what was necessary for survival. Republican ideals don't function at galactic scale. Maybe, or maybe you never tried hard enough to make them work." The custodian didn't respond, but I saw the faint tightening around his eyes that suggested I'd struck a nerve. Even these perfect warriors, genetically crafted by the Emperor himself, could apparently feel doubt. We reached a chamber that the custodian identified as the Hall of Victories. It was vast beyond comprehension, its walls covered in murals depicting 10,000 years of warfare. I saw Space Marines battling demons, guard regiments holding impossible positions, naval fleets engaging in void combat that dwarfed anything ancient Rome could have imagined. And there, in a recently completed section, I saw us. The mural showed the 14th Legion at the Battle of Palatine 4. The artist had captured the desperate defense, Romans in modern armor standing shield to shield against Chaos Space Marines, our eagle standard flying above carnage that would have made Cannae look merciful. Beneath the mural, inscribed in both Latin and Gothic, was a simple phrase: Disciplina Romana, the old strength endures. The Imperium honors those who serve with distinction, Valdor's heir said. Your legions have earned their place in our history. I stared at the mural, feeling emotions I'd long suppressed. 20 years of warfare, tens of thousands dead, all of it reduced to a piece of propaganda art that would inspire future generations to throw themselves into the meat grinder. Is this what we are now? I asked quietly. Just another tool for the Imperium to use? Another way to convince soldiers that dying in pointless wars is glorious. No war is pointless if it preserves humanity's survival. And what are we surviving for? So we can continue surviving? So we can grind through another 10,000 years of barely controlled collapse? I turned to face the custodian directly. I came from a Rome that believed it was building something. Cities, roads, laws, civilization that would outlast any individual life. What is the Imperium building besides more capacity to wage war? For a long moment, the custodian was silent. When he spoke, His voice carried something that might have been weariness in a being who'd stood watch for centuries. We build survival. In a galaxy where extinction is the alternative, survival is enough. Is it? Is mere existence worth the price you're paying? Ask the trillions who live because we hold the line. Ask the children who grow up because guard regiments like yours die to protect them. Ask yourself if you'd rather those children face tyrannid consumption or demonic possession because humanity decided survival wasn't worth the cost. I had no answer for that, because he was right, and I hated that he was right. The meeting with the Lord Commander was brief and ceremonial. He praised the Roman legions, authorized expansion to 15 regiments, granted me honors and accolades that meant nothing to a man who'd watched thousands die. I accepted with proper deference, said the words expected of me, and left feeling hollower than before. But as I departed the Imperial Palace, something unexpected happened. A child approached me, no more than 10 years old, dressed in the rags common to Terra's lower hive levels. He clutched a data slate showing images of Romans in battle, his eyes wide with the kind of hero worship I'd seen in young legionnaires before their first combat. "Are you really the first Roman?" he asked in broken low Gothic. "The one who came from the past?" I knelt to his level, ignoring the nervous guards who'd moved to intercept him. "I'm one of them, yes. Why do you ask?" "My brother joined the 3rd Legion. He sends messages sometimes. He says Romans are different, that officers care about soldiers, that if you serve well, they remember your name." The boy's voice cracked slightly. "Nobody else remembers names, except Romans." Something inside me broke and mended simultaneously. This was why, not for the Imperium's grand strategy or humanity's abstract survival, but for individual children who wanted to believe their brothers' lives mattered. For soldiers who needed to feel that their service was more than just being ammunition for an uncaring machine. "What's your brother's name?" I asked gently. "Cassius Meridian." "He's a legionnaire in 2nd cohort. I didn't know him personally. The Roman legions now numbered 80,000, but I activated my data slate and searched our records. Found him, Cassius Meridian, recruited 3 years ago from Terra's lower hives, currently serving on the Eastern Fringe. Exemplary service record. 2 commendations for courage under fire. "Your brother is a credit to Rome," I told the boy, showing him the service record. "He's fought with honor on 4 worlds. His centurion speaks highly of his discipline and courage. When he returns, if he returns, he'll have earned veteran status and the respect of his legion." The boy's face lit up with pride that made 20 years of horror almost bearable. I gave him my personal comm code. "If your brother needs anything, if his legion has failed him in any way, you contact me. Romans take care of their own. That's a promise." As the boy ran off clutching the slate with my contact information, one of my escorts, a young Tribune from the 9th Legion, spoke quietly. "You know you can't actually help every family, sir. There are tens of thousands of Romans serving, millions of family members. You'll be overwhelmed with requests." "I know," I said. But that boy needed to believe someone in the Imperium cared whether his brother lived or died. Needed to know that Romans are different, that we remember, even if I can't help everyone, I can help him. And maybe he'll tell 10 other people, and they'll tell 10 more. And slowly, gradually, the Imperium might remember that the individuals it consumes were actually human beings with names and families and lives that mattered. The Tribune was quiet for a moment. "That's very Roman of you, sir." "That's just Roman. Period." On the journey back to our staging area, I reflected on what the Roman legions had become. We numbered 80,000 across 10 regiments. We'd proven effective enough that the Departmentum Munitorum was planning expansion to 15 regiments within 5 years. Other guard units adopted our training methods, our disciplinary codes, our emphasis on unit cohesion and mutual support. But we were still just a drop in the ocean of the Imperium's military might. Billions of guard soldiers served across 1 million worlds. Our 80,000 was a rounding error in the grand calculus of galactic warfare. Yet individual drops could create ripples. I'd received reports, unofficial, passed through channels that technically violated Munitorum protocols, of other regiments implementing Roman-style reforms. Acadian unit that started recording the names and deeds of fallen soldiers. A Mordian regiment that modified its brutal disciplinary system to allow for rehabilitation rather than just execution. A Valhallan regiment that adopted cohort-style mutual support structures. None of them called themselves Romans, but they'd seen what we built and decided to try similar approaches. That was how Rome had always conquered, not just through legions, but through demonstrating that Roman methods produced better results than alternatives. The Mediterranean world hadn't been forced to adopt Roman culture. They'd chosen to because Roman culture worked. Perhaps the same could happen in the 41st millennium. Perhaps, over centuries or millennia, the Imperium might slowly evolve towards something that honored individual humans rather than just consuming them. It was probably wishful thinking. The galaxy was too dark, the threats too overwhelming, the Imperium's ossification too complete. But Romans had always been optimistic conquerors, believing that determination and virtue could overcome any obstacle. 3 months later, I stood on another battlefield, this one against orcs on a jungle world called Verdantis Prime. My personal command squad included veterans from all 10 Roman legions, a deliberately mixed unit designed to foster cooperation between regiments. Centurion Valerius was there, impossibly still alive despite 20 years of combat. He'd become a legend among Romans, the last original, the man who'd walked out of the warp storm and survived when 99% of his generation had died. "You know this will probably be the one that kills us," he observed as we prepared for the assault. The orcs had established a massive stronghold that would require frontal assault against overwhelming firepower. Casualty projections were 60 to 70%. Standard Tuesday for the Imperial Guard. "Probably," I agreed. "Does that change anything?" He laughed, the sound harsh and genuine. "Not even slightly. We're Romans. We've been accepting doomed missions since Cannae. Might as well die consistently." The assault was as brutal as projected. We lost thousands taking the orc stronghold, but we took it. And in doing so, we secured the planet for the Imperium and saved millions of civilians from orc depredation. In the aftermath, as chirurgeons worked to save the wounded and burial details processed the dead, I found myself back at that question. Was it worth it? 20 years of warfare, tens of thousands dead. My entire life since arriving in the 41st millennium, dedicated to fighting and dying, and leading others to fight and die. I thought about that boy on Terra, whose brother served in the 3rd Legion, about the soldiers who fought with pride instead of just fear because they were Romans, about the ripples spreading through the Imperial Guard as other regiments adopted our methods, about how Rome had endured for over 1,000 years in various forms because it represented something more than just military power, an idea that civilization required sacrifice, but that sacrifice should be honored, that individual humans mattered, that building something lasting was worth the cost. The 14th Legion, my legion, the one that had emerged from the warp storm, would eventually disappear. Within a generation, no original Romans would remain. Within a century, perhaps no one who'd ever met an original Roman would be alive. But the idea of Rome would persist, carried forward by soldiers who chose to be Roman, who valued discipline and honor and mutual support, who believed their service mattered. And in the darkness of the 41st millennium, ideas might be the most powerful weapons of all. Roma Invicta, I whispered to the dead, performing the ritual words over legionnaires who'd never seen ancient Rome but had died as Romans nonetheless. Roma Eterna, Rome unconquered, Rome eternal. Could ancient Rome survive the 41st millennium? No, ancient Rome was dead, buried under 40,000 years of history. But Rome's spirit, its values, its discipline, its fundamental belief that individual humans mattered and civilization was worth fighting for, that could survive, that could spread, that could slowly, gradually, over centuries and millennia, remind the Imperium what it meant to be human. We were seeds planted in the darkest soil imaginable. Whether we'd grow into something significant or simply be consumed like everything else in the Imperium's grinding machinery remained to be seen. But we'd planted ourselves. We'd taken root, and we refused to surrender. That was Roman enough for me. The eagle endured. Rome endured. And as long as even one soldier stood with Roman discipline and Roman honor, speaking Latin and carrying our values forward, Rome would never truly fall, even in the 41st millennium, even in the darkness between the stars, even when hope itself was heresy. Romans endured. That was what we did. That was what we'd always done. And that was what we'd continue doing until the last Roman fell. And even then, someone else would pick up the eagle and carry it forward. Because that was what Rome meant. Not a place, not a time, not even a people, but an idea that refused to die. Roma Invicta, Roma Eterna forever.